Delighted to be kicking off the first event of this year in our ongoing climate series with Isabel Hilton, who's been a long supporter of Young China Watchers. For those who don't know YCW, we're a global organization with chapters all around the world, focused on bringing together leaders in the China space with other members of the community to have exciting and interesting conversations about topics emerging from China today. Isabel Hilton, for those who don't know, is a London-based, although currently in Scotland, writer and broadcaster, as well as the founder of China Dialogue Trust, and now its senior advisor. China Dialogue is a Chinese English website focused on China and the environment, as well as climate change. Last year, YCW kicked off this China climate series with an event looking at China's leadership in the climate space. And it's fair to say, since the beginning of January last year, when we had that event, a lot has changed, obviously COVID, but also the US election has played a large part in shifting the geopolitical dynamics again in the climate space. And so in terms of starting us off this evening, Isabel, I thought it would make sense to start off by looking at these geopolitical changes that have happened in the last year, namely the change from the Trump administration, who had stepped back from the Paris Agreement, had stepped back from the US's climate ambition that had grown under Obama, and that now shifting to the Biden administration, who last month held the Earth Summit, which brought Xi Jinping to speak on climate change. And so it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on what this dynamic from the US initially leading, then taking a step back, and then stepping up again. What does that dynamic mean for China's global leadership in the climate space?
It's a great question, Sarah. And I just to start off with, I'm really always delighted to be talking to Young China Watchers. I am a huge fan of the organization. It's been great to see it grow and thrive. And it's always such a pleasure. So to your question, first of all, the US coming back is clearly a very good thing. And let's hope they stay in after the next US election. Although China is the world's biggest emitter, the US is still a huge emitter in its own right. And on a per capita basis, it's way ahead of China and Europe. So we need the US in for its own climate ambitions. We need it in for its financial contribution to help poorer countries adapt and make low carbon choices that they need to make at this point. And we need the US in for its convening power, which is still pretty unmatched, regardless of the damage that Trump may have done to that. And you're absolutely right that China, when Trump was in power in the United States, China was able to claim climate leadership. There are three big climate blocks in the world: the European Union, the United States, and China. And if the United States left, that left the other two pretty exposed. And I remember at Davos in 2017, just after the election, the US election, Xi Jinping appeared in a suit and tie to a very nervous global elite and essentially said, stay calm, China's with us, China is committed to globalization and is committed to climate change. China is not going to renege on its promises. And everyone heaved a huge sigh of relief. And then China kind of was assumed to have a mantle of leadership. And that was pretty much all it took. And that was almost all China did in terms of climate leadership. Its emissions continue to rise. There was a lot of internal policy adjustment going on, but it didn't show in any mitigation effort. So, a lot of those internal policies were about energy efficiency, which China needed to do anyway, and around investment in transitional technologies and low carbon technologies. And that has been very important. There are lots of ways to lead in climate policy, and some of the smaller countries that have really fantastic records on reducing emissions. And when Xi Jinping and Obama did their deal before Paris, they pledged to work together towards an agreement in Paris to cooperate with each other, and lots of bilateral mechanisms were set up. And that, I think, was very encouraging to China because China was operating in a friendly geostrategic environment when climate change was, a shared goal. So it was extremely constructive. Most of that got killed off by Trump. So we're looking now at a landscape of entrenched hostility and competition, and frankly, reduced cooperation. Now, competition can be good if it's a race to the top. Xi Jinping produced the big surprise last September before the US elections of the net zero pledge by 2060. So thus far, we have that signal from China, which is very positive, but we've also got a lot of negative signals. The fact that the 14th plan talked more about security and not much about climate. And that is one byproduct of the geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. China's thinking about energy security, so it's hanging on to coal. And that's really bad for climate. So China's recovery package, it's not green. And that also reflects Beijing's anxieties about internal and external security. So what these tensions do, it's not that they make China turn away from its acknowledgement of climate change, but they allow other things to rise to the top of the agenda. So climate takes second or third place. And the big risk is that we do hear arguments from the US far right, for example, and from some voices in Europe that say we shouldn't talk to China about anything, not even climate. So the effort really has to be to try to insulate the climate discussion that we cannot afford to lose as far as we can from other tensions. And the difficulty with that is that as climate change is less and less a silo issue, and rightly so, it becomes more the business of every ministry in every country and every industry in every country. So the greater the risk that something might blow up over a different issue and sabotage climate discussions. It could be worse. We're very fortunate to the degree that Xie Zhenhua and John Kerry they have a genuinely strong personal relationship and a shared common purpose, and they're both tough and they both want to get things done. And without that, it would be worse. But it's delicate, frankly. It's not that either side has given up on climate, but that other things at this point really get in the way.
Yeah, understood. And on that point that you make around the relationship that does exist between US and China cooperation and how that has kind of dissipated under Trump, but then you alluded there to saying that there is still some level of a relationship. And so in the context of COP26 coming to the UK this year, do you see that cooperation between the US and China happening in a similar way to how it happened under the Obama administration? Or do you think we're in a completely different state now? And what cooperation opportunities do exist for US, China in the run up to COP?
Well, I think we're in a different state. And I'm not sure that those particular mechanisms will be easily reconstituted, partly because everyone's industrial policy, for one thing, has moved on, and because the trade tensions and the strategic tensions are so strong. However, if we assume that both the United States and China have an interest in success in Glasgow, and I very much hope that we can assume that, that's certainly what they say. So the art of the game is to stop other things getting in the way. Now, there are a lot of open issues in the run-up to Glasgow. There are still some bits of the Paris Agreement that need to be nailed down, the so-called bits of the so-called rule book. But the big issue really is the question of a transfer of funds to developing countries to help them make the choices they need to make, and in some cases also to help them adapt. Now, there was a pledge in Copenhagen from the United States of mobilizing $100 million a year, $100 billion, dollars every year to that purpose. And although, funds indeed have been mobilized, but not enough, certainly not that. Now, if we don't get substantial progress on that before Glasgow, then we're going to be looking at a conference in which half the parties are going to be aggrieved And those are the developing countries that feel that the rich countries have shortchanged them and haven't kept their promise. Now, China has traditionally positioned itself as a kind of lead player for those countries, although, you know, China is the biggest emitter and is now a middle-income country, but it still quite likes to play that role. So I think what would be extremely constructive, and this really does have to happen in the months before Glasgow, it's not something you can sort out, you know, at the last minute in December, that the United States and China could agree a joint effort on the mobilization of funds. They could also, for example, agree common standards for green investments. You know, China has huge investments outside China. As we know, most of them are not very climate friendly. A lot of fossil energy, a lot of new coal, a lot of infrastructure. None of that is particularly climate friendly. But China is talking about greening its own investment portfolio. Now, the European Union has, for example, a taxonomy of what counts as a green investment. And that is a discussion that is still very much going on. You know, does clean coal, for example, really exist, which is, you know, something that you still find in the Chinese portfolio, but most people agree, you know, should go. If the United States, China, and the European Union could agree, you know, a common taxonomy, that would really be a very positive signal. So there are lots of ways in which, not directly to do with mitigation, but to do with setting the conditions and the expectations for the transition that we need to see, that China and the United States could cooperate, or in not cooperating, they could certainly slow things down. So I guess that's what we have to try to mobilize now.
Yeah. And on that point, what do you think the likelihood is that there will be this cooperative agreement on things like setting standards? Or do you think we're more likely to kind of continue on with the EU taxonomy, the EU setting a certain standard, the US setting a standard, China setting a standard? Or is there some things that have happened in the last year that make it seem more likely that there is this recognition of the need or the desire for a global standard?
I think there are both things are going on, in fact. So the EU and China have talked, you know, quite explicitly about a shared taxonomy. The US is kind of coming to the game a little late, but certainly those technical talks are possible between the EU and the US. So it is possible. I think it's in very early days, frankly, and I think also that there are things that could derail those conversations. I mean, you know, the EU and China did have a relatively uncomplicated conversation on climate change, but relations between the EU and China have also deteriorated in the last couple of years. That's partly COVID. That's partly wolf warrior diplomacy. It's also Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and public reactions to those. It's the exchange of sanctions. You know, the Chinese have sanctioned a German Green MEP just at the time when the German Greens are poised to make quite substantial gains in the upcoming German elections. You know, it's not helpful. It really has soured the mood. So when you come to talk about things that could in and of themselves be difficult and sensitive, there's a thing called CBAM, which is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And that is about what tariffs it's about how you protect your industries if they are taking on greater costs to produce, for example, low carbon goods, or let it be steel or cement. Let's imagine that. You don't want your industry to be undercut by cheap imports from elsewhere. So you put essentially a carbon tax on steel, which is produced in a high carbon location, and that protects low carbon production. Now, this is, of course, anything to do with trade is highly contentious, and it's going to take an awful lot of, you know, quite serious negotiation to avoid this becoming a bit of a crisis between the EU and China. China is extremely hostile to it, and the EU is extremely certain that this is necessary, because how can you protect your industries through a transition without it? So, you know, there are some very knotty problems here, and if the general relationship is also tense, then it doesn't favor these kind of difficult negotiations. So there are lots of things that could still be problematic.
Yeah, no, definitely. I could appreciate that this is a complex issue to discuss, and there's a lot of different levers at play. And so in terms of the US-China relationship, do you think Europe plays, or the UK, especially given it has COP this year, plays an important role in how that US-China relationship is either escalated or de-escalated in the run-up? Or is this something that's much more of a kind of bilateral relationship?
Up to a point, I would say. I mean, there was a point when things were particularly difficult over Hong Kong, for example, that the UK was having some difficulty getting senior enough representation from China at meetings. So, you know, these things do matter. We've had a sort of curious dance between the EU, China, and the US. In a way, they've both the US and China have wanted to claim the EU as, you know, its special friend, and the EU and the US have essentially reached rather similar conclusions about the relationship with China, which is, you know, compete, yes, cooperate where you can, and kind of confront where you must, and essentially that's the kind of that's the framework in which they're both trying to operate. But the EU has also made quite clear that it values what it calls strategic autonomy. In other words, it's not simply going to do the United States' bidding vis-a-vis China. And there's quite a lot of resistance to various US desires, you know, on trade, for example, or on cybersecurity, on Huawei. You know, it's not entirely a straightforward conversation either between the US and the European Union. And I guess if we'd been looking at this maybe even just a year ago, we would have thought that the EU was much closer to China than it looks now. Things really have deteriorated. But at the same time, although there is an alignment of values, I think quite explicitly, between Europe and the United States, there isn't really an alignment of methods, or as you know, and I don't think there will be. So what China seemed to be anxious about was a kind of ganging up between Europe and the US against China on this and other issues. And I think that everyone is going to try to be quite careful about that. As far as Britain goes, I think, you know, Britain obviously has a big convening role this year. I think once the COP is over, that will fade away and Britain will be very tied up with its own issues, dealing with Brexit particularly. And so its influence really, it needs to exert its influence this year, because I think it's going to be hard to replicate that, not when it's no longer hosting a COP.
Yeah, and on that note of the UK, have you seen them doing things this year around trying to influence China or bring China into the field in the run-up to COP, or is that more held back for now?
No, I think it's, you know, that is definitely what you have to do if you're the host of the COP. You know, it's not just about the catering and making sure that the arrangements are comfortable. You know, what produced Paris was, you know, at least 2 years of really sophisticated effort by French diplomacy, you know, visiting absolutely everybody, finding out what their sticking points were, what they hoped to get, what they wouldn't agree to, and just managing all of that. And one of the unknowns at the moment, because of the situation we're all in, is how much, you know, how much the next COP will be physical and how much will be hybrid, because actually managing that kind of negotiation virtually is really difficult. And one of the difficulties that the UK has faced has been, how do you do that, when you can't meet? There's so much that happens in negotiations that happens because you meet, because you're in the same room, and virtual doesn't really, it doesn't really carry the same. It doesn't open the same possibilities. So that has been hard, and certainly, the UK has been working at it. And clearly, China, and keeping China on board is a massive challenge and massively important. So of course, Britain has been doing that and will continue to do that. It's a very, very peculiar year. It's a very peculiar COP. The other thing that, of course, is happening is the CBD COP15, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which China is hosting, and that was to have been in Kunming last year. It's now been bumped. It was bumped to early this year. It's been bumped again to October, possibly in Kunming, possibly virtual, possibly hybrid. And that's an equally important convention in a process that has not been as successful, even as, you might think that the climate convention has faced some headwinds, but the Biological Diversity Convention has pretty much missed every target that's been set. And it's a key moment because a new set of targets have to be negotiated with delivery mechanisms, and China is hosting that. And that is a real test of leadership. The two are related because, climate clearly impacts nature and nature clearly impacts climate, but they're negotiated sort of separately. And I think had we not been in the middle of a pandemic, there would have been much more visible effort to try to bring these two agendas together. Everyone is kind of nodding to the need to do that, but in practice, there's only so much bandwidth, and I think it hasn't happened to the degree that it might have done, and might have also fed into a kind of constructive set of relationships that would have assisted us in Glasgow. So that's also been pretty tricky.
Yes, yeah, and of course with both COP and with CBD, you kind of alluded to the fact that you have one aspect, which is the targets and the opportunity to reset targets, but you have the other aspect that's the mechanisms and the actions behind actually bringing those targets to life. For the CBD, you said that the targets that have been set haven't been met. Is there some key reasons as to why those targets haven't been met? And do you think there's some cross learnings between COP and CBD on that front?
Well, to be fair to the CBD process, it is rather more complicated trying to stop a mass extinction even than climate change. Climate change has a cause and effect, and we kind of know what we need to do. What the difficulty is mobilizing everyone to do it, and overcoming the technological and economic and political obstacles to that. I mean, at its simplest end, I don't know if you remember the Montreal Protocol, which was about it was about the release of chemicals that were damaging the ozone layer. And it's often pointed to as a huge success, and that's true. But it was one chemical, one set of chemicals, in fact. And that's not, it didn't involve, retuning your entire industrial economy at all. And yes, it was, and I guess when you go to the other end of the spectrum, I would put climate change kind of in the middle, and biodiversity at the other end, because it's complicated. There are so many causes, so many reasons, so many ways in which we damage nature. It's diverse, and finding a delivery and enforcement mechanism that addresses all of the manifold, ways in which we do damage nature has proved difficult. And even now, frankly, in the discussions on the CBD, it's not clear that we're going to end up with anything other than another set of targets, and no way really to ensure that they're delivered. So it's more difficult, and I think that the learnings don't really read across very much, except for the the mutual impact. There is an impact in both directions. And so I think for climate people who really haven't paid a lot of attention to CBD in the past. I think to be, to recognize the importance of a successful biodiversity convention and to support that would also in turn assist in climate change.
Yeah, understood. And to go back to your comment there around kind of the difference between COP and CBD, obviously COP, one of the big things that it's known for, and one of the reasons people were very excited about COP last year, which has now been stalled to this year, is that it was an opportunity to reassess the Paris Agreement NDCs, the national targets set by various different countries on how they wanted to approach climate change. And so we've seen China last year coming out with its 2060 carbon neutrality pledge. Do you think these targets are going to be tightened up or going to be heightened in time for COP this year? And then back to your point on you've got the targets, but you've also got the mechanisms to put them in place. What's China doing to get these mechanisms in place to get this 2060 target to come to life?
Well, just for those who don't eat and sleep climate change, perhaps we should make clear what Paris actually commits us to. There is a mid-century target, which is essentially, well, the signatories of the Paris Agreement have pledged to keep global average temperature rises well below 2 degrees centigrade, and that was tightened to 1.5 after a very sobering report that essentially says even at 1.5 you lose 90% of the corals, and at 2 degrees you lose. It's very, very bleak. So we need to move as fast as we can and as firmly as we can. Now, Paris was a success in many ways because what it said was, we want everyone in the tent, and you bring to the table what you can bring to the table. You decide. That's the nationally determined contribution. But given that what was put on the table in Paris, and this was not a surprise, takes us to about 3 degrees of warming. The understanding was that every 5 years we would come back, we would look at it again, and the expectation would be that everybody would tighten their ambition and tighten their targets. And so that's the process that we're all meant to be engaged in. Now, what had China done? Since Paris, China's emissions have continued to rise. But, we did have the 2060 target declared last year. And that's the first time that China had declared an actual, emissions target of that nature. All its previous policies had been to do with things like energy density, which is the amount of energy it takes to produce a certain, level of value of GDP. And that was fine, but you can be more efficient and still use more energy and still produce more emissions. So it doesn't in itself, bring down your emissions. An absolute target is what it looks like. It's 2060. It should be 2050, but there is room there. There is wiggle room. You all know China. You all know that what China prefers to do is to set quite soft targets and overshoot rather than to set ambitious targets and not meet them. You're in real political trouble if you don't meet your targets in China. But if you set low ambition and meet it, that's fine. And that's the other target that was set in at the UN. The other pledge that was made was to peak emissions before 2030. Now, frankly, that's what was on the table in Paris. That's what China said in 2016, so 2015. So, we haven't really, if it doesn't get any better than that, we haven't really advanced. And even in 2015, if you talk to modelers in China, climate modelers, they would tell you that China could peak, at 2022, 2023, that 2030 was a soft target, even back in 2015, and it's still a soft target. So, there is certainly room, shall we say, for China to tighten its ambition. as to whether it will get there, well, of course, everybody scrutinized the 14th five-year plan very closely for signs of, the beginning of this radical transition. There have been various, models and pathways that have been described. The 14th five-year plan didn't seem to advance us very much, frankly. As I say, there was more talk of energy security than there was of climate change, and coal is still in there. And really, the kind of the failure to eliminate coal is pretty depressing for everybody. There were some other targets that, again, China's own, climate policy people had hoped would be a bit tighter. So it's not a great leap forward yet. In order to meet the 2060 target, China is going to have to, obviously the biggest challenge is decarbonizing the primary energy system, the electricity system. And of course, as you electrify, and we're all going to be electrifying, including in, transport and heating our homes, you need more electricity. So it's even more important that the electricity you produce is green electricity. So there's going to have to be, coal is going to have to start to disappear from China's primary electricity system. And unless that happens soon, unless it begins to happen soon, China just leaves itself a harder task after 2030. If it peaked its emissions in 2023, it peaks at a lower level, and it doesn't have so far to come down, and it has more time to do it. So, it hasn't. I'm very glad that there is a target. I think we would all like to see slightly more convincing progress towards it. But on the upside, China has invested heavily in low carbon technologies of all kinds as an industrial strategy. So China does have a serious and multifaceted interest in a successful decarbonizing world. China's the supplier of low carbon goods and services to that effort. So China needs that, and China needs it for itself as well as for the world. So that's positive. The other thing I guess I'd like to see or be reassured about is that the target of 2060 is for CO2. CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. It's not even the nastiest greenhouse gas. Methane, for example, is a nasty greenhouse gas. Non-CO2 greenhouse gases are around 20% of China's climate altering gases. So again, there's been a bit of a, it's a bit fuzzy quite what's intended for those, because the target addresses CO2. But it would be encouraging to see, some firm action, for example, on non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And I think we're also beginning to see sectoral effort. So we're beginning to see the demand that the steel industry, for example, lay out its plans, for a low carbon transition. So things are happening, and they could be happening faster, but they are happening. And one of the difficulties that China has, as just as a large version of the difficulties that everybody has, if your economy is geared up to be a fossil dependent economy, changing that just requires a shed load of new regulations and laws and standards and practices and all of that. It does take time, but you have to make it mandatory. You have to make it very clear from the government level in China that you're very serious and that you expect everyone to make progress. We're beginning to see that kind of insistence. So
yeah. And suppose that does happen and the regulation and the action does come into line, which means that the coal industry, the steel industry, the concrete industry that are currently heavily based in China starts moving perhaps to other developing countries. Do you think that is a likely scenario, that once kind of China gets its regulation in place, that it overspills into being some other nation's problem? And are China or other countries doing something about this? I know you mentioned how there is the impetus there to put in $100 billion per year for developing countries, but what's really being done to make sure that once, you know, a certain country really sets down the rules on these heavily polluting industries, that it doesn't then happen elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, that is exporting your dirty industries, of course, is something that, you know, all industrialized countries as they become post-industrial have done. And perhaps that will continue to happen. However, I think that what we will be transitioning out of is a world in which goods and goods particularly that are produced in high emitting countries will not have free access to global markets, and that will make a difference. Now, if developing countries are to produce goods in a low emissions manner, they're going to need to be supported to develop energy systems that are low emissions, and China could play a huge role in that. Now, you know, it's not that developing economies or emerging economies are particularly eager to embrace coal, although a lot of them have embraced coal. A lot of them have embraced coal because China has supplied them with coal-fired power stations in a package that includes the finance and the expertise, and, you know, has built them. And that locks a country into 30 years of emissions from that plant, or it obliges it to close the plant down before essentially it's paid for itself. So it's not a good deal anymore. And last year in particular, we saw countries saying, we don't want these anymore. So Bangladesh, Pakistan, you know, a number of countries have said to China, I know we talked about this coal-fired power plant or these coal-fired power plants, but we don't think they're a very good idea. Now, what China could do, and there are various structural reasons that have made this difficult, but it's not insuperable, given that it is the world's largest producer of renewable technologies. You know, it could, as a development actor, present to its partners the proposition that China would help them to develop a 21st century energy system, not a 19th century energy system. And that requires a different kind of grid. It requires quite a lot of, you know, technology and know-how. And it's not something that everybody has in abundance. But, you know, that would be doing host countries an enormous favor. It would also be doing China an enormous favor in terms of its global reputation and its renewables, its renewable industries. So China does have a tremendous potential here to allow, to assist countries that need energy systems in order to develop, to have an energy system that is not a stranded asset. So yes, I think that there is a risk, but I also think, as I said, that access to global markets for goods produced in high carbon environments is going to be more and more difficult.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made there around the importance of electrification and the importance of transferring across to renewables relates to a question from Rothbart, and he was asking for you to explain more about what China is currently doing on coal.
Still building, I'm afraid. You know, about 4 years ago, everybody thought that because it went down a bit, everybody thought it had peaked. Look, as a percentage of primary energy, it is less than it was, but that's because other things have expanded. There's been an enormous, you know, effort to grow nuclear, hydro, and wind and solar. So it's not that China's coal use is actually reduced. And the bizarre thing is that most of the coal-fired power plants that are operating in China are operating at well below capacity. They're operating around 40%. So there's a huge amount of spare capacity, and it really doesn't make much sense to go on building them. They're not making money, and they're not really necessary. You know, there are coal-fired power plants which are being built in places with surplus energy, which is why, you know, why they're operating below capacity. Also, a few years ago, China did address a problem that had arisen through the rapid expansion of its renewables industry, which was curtailment, and that was to do That was to do with the contract system in the Chinese energy system. So, you know, being an old socialist country, energy companies had annual contracts and quotas, and it was all paid for. So they delivered it. And if you bring on a new source of energy like renewables, which is variable in what it produces, if you look at what happens in the United States, for example, there's just a constant negotiation about access to the grid and pricing, which goes minute by minute. You know, something comes in, you know, slightly cheaper, and the grid will take it. Whereas what was happening in China was that you could have fantastic wind blowing in Mongolia and you know, turbines whizzing round, but they couldn't get on the grid. So it was just wasted. That's curtailment. To deal with that, China did introduce a system of green dispatch, which meant that when renewables were producing, they had priority. But of course, that was heavily resisted by the coal-fired power stations, because that meant, you know, that was their share that was being given to somebody else. So I can't see there's a future for coal in China beyond spinning out what is already there. And in about 2013, when the Belt and Road first began to be promoted, the coal companies were terribly interested in this, because you know, they could see there was, you know, a measure of writing on the wall in China, but there were whole new markets to explore along the Belt and Road, and we've had quite a lot of that. So if countries on the Belt and Road really do adopt the China model, they will double their emissions. China doubled its emissions in the first decade of this century by expanding coal to fuel its industrial revolution. If other countries follow that, then it's all over for the climate. So it really matters that China switch its effort to supporting countries to go renewable rather than with coal.
That touches exactly on a question that came in from Yana, asking for your thoughts or comments on the recent G7 countries' agreement to reduce their investment in foreign coal, and asking whether China is likely to join in with any of these voluntary commitments of a similar kind ahead of COP this year.
Well, not before time, you might say. Yeah. I mean, we do go on about China, partly because that's what we look at. But you know, China's not the only important country that's invested in coal overseas. In Japan, South Korea, but you know, they are kind of beginning to say no, we won't do it anymore. And we also discovered the other day, which I didn't know, the degree to which Western finance invests in coal in China. So, you know, nobody's record is entirely spotless here. But the more we find out about where the money goes, the more we can insist that it go to a better destination. China, I think, will not want to be an outlier in this. It's not a good look to be the only country that doesn't have a kind of prohibition on investing in new coal, but China tends to move fairly slowly on this kind of thing. I think that could be something that China could announce before Glasgow. It would be a very positive announcement were China to make it. And I think that eventually, of course, China will get there, but you know, we really would appreciate it if China were to move a little more swiftly down that road.
Yeah, I think we're all in that same camp there. There's a question that came in from Seth asking, do we have any sense of when China's revised NDC will be released, and any sense of what will be in the revised NDC?
But
the golden question.
Do let us know. I mean, I have to say, Xi Jinping keeps his cards pretty close to his chest. I mean, even his own experts were slightly surprised by the UN General Assembly announcement, and there was a bit of a scramble to try to produce modelling that would fit the announcement. It was a total cliffhanger as to whether Xi Jinping would attend Biden's meeting the other week. And although we do expect China to to put a slightly better offer on the table, it's really not clear what will be in it. Whatever is going to be in it, there wasn't much clue in the 14th five-year plan. As I say, I think, you know, an external pledge would be good. There's plenty of room to tighten the 2030 Peking pledge. And if they don't do that, you know, that will be pretty disappointing. So, you know, those are two offers. Maybe something on non-CO2 emissions, but I'm guessing. I'm looking forward to your telling me.
Very good. There's also a question coming in that also relates to that space, which is, what do you think about China's reluctance to accelerate climate goals due to the fact that its carbon debt is lower than that of other developed countries?
It's carbon debt in the sense of historic emissions, or?
I'm afraid I don't have the more background, but if you'd like to take it as historic emissions, then go for it.
I think, well, I think it just comes down to the cultural and political practice of setting targets that they know are meetable. And I mean, I've watched the evolution of climate policy in China over a number of years now, and I do remember back in 2006, 2007, when at that time, China, as a non-Annex 1 signatory of the Kyoto Protocol, was not obliged to, there were no mandatory legal obligations to cut emissions. China positioned itself as a developing country. It had a right to develop, and essentially the burden was to fall on the richer developed nations. And that was the Kyoto Protocol, phase 1. So we've made some progress, but part of that progress came through the education of the leadership. It was in 2005, when China became the world's biggest emitter, and there was a sort of growing realization in Beijing that this was diplomatically difficult, and so it proved. And also an effort to educate the leadership on climate change, on what it meant, on China's own fantastic vulnerabilities to climate impacts, on the fact that, you know, if things went on as they did and China did not get a grip on its emissions, then the efforts of everybody else, you know, were pretty pointless, because China is so big. So watching that process, I remember being told around 2008 that the leadership felt that 2 degrees was just not possible, and that 3 or 4 degrees was livable. And that was a very, very dangerous thought. You know, 3 or 4 degrees, even 2 degrees is very dangerous. 3 or 4 degrees is completely unknown territory. So it's been a process of learning, including from the leadership. And once you grasp the implications of climate change, and you look at what China had built in the previous 2 to 3 decades, you know, that is a complete U-turn required, and that is a big and complicated thing to do. First of all, you have to convince the rest of the country, which, as you know, in China is not entirely straightforward. You have to devise policy frameworks which ensure that your goals are in fact met at every level of government. To do that, you have to educate every level of government on what the dangers and possibilities are. So all of this takes time. And I think that the reluctance to move faster in some ways reflects the scale of the task and the kind of experimental step-by-step policy experimentation that China likes to do. But there is no rapid, easy way to do this. So, you know, China doesn't want to be embarrassed by a failure.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's, yeah, as with all of these things, very complicated. Ali has asked, based on the fact that it costs about 1 billion to invest in a coal plant, but a nuclear power plant or a dam costs a lot more, 5 billion. what should developing countries do who need more energy to meet their demands, but don't have the money to invest in clean energy?
Well, it depends what you call clean energy. Both nuclear and big hydro are they have their opponents as well as their fans. But for about 4 or 5 years now, in most recent energy auctions or bids, the cost per unit of output of renewable energy has been cheaper than coal. Coal is no longer cheap. Even if you leave out all the collateral damage that coal does, the damage to health, the damage in China, coal at one point was using 20% of China's available fresh water. In North China, where there isn't much available fresh water, 40% of China's rail network was shifting coal. There are all kinds of costs associated with coal which aren't counted. But in most geographies now, it's cheaper to build wind and solar plants than it is to build coal. The complication comes, as I said, in building storage, in balancing the grid, in managing the grid. But in the end, that's what they're going to have to do. So it's, you don't go to a country now and propose to build a fixed line telephone network. You go and you say, we're going to build you the best mobile network you've ever seen. Why would you go and build coal-fired power stations and then have to wire them up to the entire country when you can have, renewables prosumers all over your country, when you can light up distant villages, for example, without having to connect them to a national grid or to a power station. You're looking at a different system, and you're looking at a system with a future. So that's really what we should be supporting countries to do. It is no longer more expensive. And that's largely down to China's ability to manufacture at scale. That's what brought the price down.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, it's exciting to see that transition and see that there is now potential for it to make not just climate sense, but also economic sense to do the best thing for the climate. And just a couple more questions before we finish up. There's a question coming back to the carbon border adjustment mechanism that you touched on earlier, asking whether the CBAM is a good mechanism to force China to decarbonize its production, or is it just more of a strategic trade measure?
I probably start from the other end, that if I was looking to make my own steel industry low carbon, I would need to protect it. And the same is true of cement, actually. We can produce low carbon cement, very low carbon cement. It's more expensive. And if cheap cement is flooding in, it's not going to happen. So I think that is that's the starting point. If you want Europe to make that transition, then you have to figure out a mechanism to protect its industry while that transition happens. Will that force China? Well, if we were to take a constructive view, it's complicated to do, but China is embarked on emissions trading mechanisms, for example, which were closely modeled in many ways on the European system. The European system, after a long hiatus, I think is beginning to get a price that is useful. There's not much point in having a trading mechanism when the price is too low to make a difference, but the price has been rising. To link Europe's trading mechanism and China's trading mechanism and relate it to high emitting industries, or to sectors like cement and steel, would mean that China was producing low carbon cement or steel, or at least the price of the cement and steel that it was producing was reflected the embedded carbon. And that would be, a relatively, again, a kind of constructive way to approach it. But I think it is extremely tricky. And certainly the opinion in China seems to regard it as another way of discriminating in trade policy. And I think that's going to take a lot of getting over. But I don't see that we can avoid that conversation. I think it's a conversation we have to have. Otherwise, how does Europe make its own transition? By the way, it's quite complicated with the United States as well. But, you know, this is the world we're in. We're trying to do something quite difficult.
Yeah. And relating to that as well, in some ways, Rothbart's asking for your views on the use of a carbon tax.
I've always been rather keen on a carbon tax, mainly because I find the kind of trading system so extraordinarily frustrating. You know, there was a huge amount of activity and lots of jobs created, but not much carbon saved. And it always seemed to me to be rather, you know, more straightforward somehow to have a carbon tax. I'm not sure that having both is going to function. But one of the reasons that we don't have a carbon tax is that back in the days of Kyoto, when the United States was still in the game, or very much in the game, the US was so hostile to the notion of a tax, you know, the T word couldn't be introduced, that, you know, they wanted to insist on market mechanisms. So market mechanisms we have, and then they didn't ratify Kyoto anyway. So, hey, but we're stuck with it. And it has its proponents. I just find carbon tax rather simpler, more straightforward and more direct. But, you know, any such mechanism generates argument and controversy. So I could be quite wrong. And certainly there are people who disagree.
Thanks. And final question before we close off is from Yana. She's asking, what other countries in Asia would you say might have the biggest impact on the outcome of COP26 apart from China? And what might the role be of ASEAN countries? And also, as part of that question, what leadership role might China be playing in this region? A difficult question to answer in 1 minute.
I mean, Asian countries, of course, the next most important Asian country in climate-wise is India. And India's per capita emissions are tiny compared to China's. China's per capita emissions are bigger than the UK. So, you know, we're looking at a very, very different profile. But that's partly because of different stages of development, and so the hope is that India, as it as it grows, and it has all sorts of demographic advantages and expectations of growth, that it grows. It has a huge solar mission. If that solar mission really works, we might see India, grow its economy without this vast sudden growth in emissions. If it doesn't do that, then it's really difficult. So I would, just in terms of scale and volume, I guess I would put India, next. I mean, there are other countries that whose conduct and approach is significant because it's highly symbolic. Japan is one. Japan has a lot of coal too, and as we know, after Fukushima, Japan's domestic energy profile became very complicated, and one result was that more coal was burned and more emissions. That is slowly beginning to change. Ditto, I guess, South Korea. Leadership in the region on climate. I'm not sure that China plays, a huge leadership role in climate beyond this absolutely embedded industrial policy of being the provider of low carbon goods and technologies, and therefore the enabler of other countries' transition. But beyond that, I think China is probably more concerned with its domestic transition than it is of offering itself as a regional leader on climate.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to see how that will evolve over the coming years, as well as the dynamics of geopolitics in that region, but also globally begin to shift. But I know we're over time, so I'll close it off there. But thank you very much, Isabel, for joining us this evening. I've been writing down notes of your predictions for COP.
Oh dear.
So I'm sure there'll be a sweepstake going on. But thank you very much for joining, and thank you everybody in the audience as well.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really a pleasure.